the foot of the Pyrenees, bordering the Basque Country and Navarre, the Ebro and Oja valleys are home to the most prestigious Spanish vineyards, La Rioja. Protected by the Cantabrian Mountains and the Ebro River that runs through it, this territory, inhabited by the vineyards since the Middle Ages, acquired its letters of nobility in the 19th century. The phylloxera crisis, which strikes the neighboring French vines, gives these vines the opportunity to develop. In the following years, Spain opts for mass production, and 1 century later, it becomes home to the largest wine-growing territory in the world, with 2.5 million acres of vines. On the fringes of this evolution, a handful of winemakers from Rioja strive to preserve traditions and craftsmanship. In this ocean of vines, Rioja represents just 5% of Spain's wine production. In the small town of Cerro, a dozen wine growers resist against mass production, preserving local traditional winemaking methods that distinguish this spot from the rest of Spain. Maria Urrutia is one of the heirs of the Cune Bodega, one of the oldest wine houses in the region. For 140 years, it has been producing one of Spain's greatest wines, the Imperial. The estate's history and that of her family is guarded like a treasure in these endless underground cellars. We are in what we call the underground cellars, although it has always been called the wine cemetery. Personally, I don't like calling it that, because that's where we go when we're dead. Here, it's the opposite. Wine is a living thing. It evolves constantly, and our wines are characterized by their longevity and their great capacity for long life and aging. Although it is like a graveyard, because of how these bottles are arranged, resting peacefully until one day the opportunity arises to open them. 40,000 bottles repose in these dark cellars, wrapped in a veil of mold that preserves them from the effects of time. After 5 years in barrels, a selection of bottles finds refuge here for many years. The domain's wine storage method gives certain vintages an exceptional market value. Some rare bottles will be invited to the world's finest tables, while others, in the silence of the cellars, testify to the vineyard's history. Everything is preserved here. Our philosophy is not to open the bottles immediately. This is our historical heritage, our story, our DNA. Each of these bottles express who we are, the quality, the prestige we have acquired over 140 years, and which we hope to continue to attain and transmit to following generations. La Rioja has one of the most developed network of cellars in the world. Centennial bottles are at rest here, attesting to the work accomplished. 1954, a 60-year-old bottle of our Imperial is resting here. The level of the wine remains high. That's wonderful. It is maintained in optimal conditions. Here we have some bottles that we put here more recently. This one is hardly 4 years old. Here we have all the present, past, and future of the winery. It's our story, our family tree. Here is our soul. Inside this labyrinth is the Urrutia family's wine crypt, a private catacombs which holds bottles from great vintages. Every generation has deposited its contribution here. I'm going to turn on the flashlight. It's barely visible, There we begin to see them. Higher up, you see how all the bottles are stored? It's even better here, look. You see on the walls how mold covers the bottles? It's almost impossible to identify where a bottle is. They look almost like bottles in the Titanic's cellar, found underwater. Here it's the same, with the difference that, thanks to this mold, they are still drinkable and perfectly preserved. Down here in this family cellar, I acquire even more strength and motivation because I see my ancestors' legacy and the one I personally want to leave. These long tunnels, filled with priceless treasures, date back to 1870, when the town of Cerro became the epicenter of viticulture in Rioja. The wine trade exploded at this time, thanks to the development of new transport methods. The reason why my ancestors decided to settle here and start their vineyard in Cerro comes mainly due to the presence of the train station. We can see here how a century ago, the railway crossed the estate. It even entered the cellar. The reason was that at the time, the wine was transported in barrels, and we didn't have a truck to transport the barrels, just the train. The train connected the port of Bilbao in France. Thanks to that, we exported to France, and Bordeaux in particular, whose vineyards had been devastated by phylloxera. The French had to find a place to make their wine. At that time, the city of Cerro enjoyed great prosperity. Thanks to these exchanges with France, La Rioja's winemakers drew heavily on their expertise in traditional Bordeaux techniques. Supplying a large part of Europe, La Rioja made use of technical solutions developed in France. Oak maturing, replanting, and vine grafting techniques that will improve the quality of Spanish wines. But the evolutions didn't stop with winemaking techniques. At the request of the Urrutia family, Gustave Eiffel himself imagined a new metal building frame. You must put yourself in the historical context. In 1909, it was truly revolutionary, because our nave has no columns. At that time, the work was done entirely by hand, totally artisanal and traditional. They had to move the barrels one by one, to manipulate them on one side or the other, and a column in the middle would have impeded the circulation of the barrels. Freeing up the central space made their work much easier. Northern Spain had vineyards well before the success of the 19th century production that made the fortune of Maria's family and others. Wine traditions existed here long before then. Thanks to ancient writings dating back to the 12th century, we know today that viticulture was born much earlier in this region. 12 miles from Cerro, near the town of Logroño, the Yuso Monastery preserves precious manuscripts in its archives. The medieval historian Javier Garcia Turza, a specialist in the history of viticulture in Spain, has discovered exceptional works here.
While studying medieval texts and lithographs from Rioja, I was able to identify 3 points that highlight the presence of viticulture in the Middle Ages in this region. At that time, viticulture was already linked to agriculture, which was a major economic force here. Wine was also considered a drink for pleasure, and it had an indispensable place in religious services. In a way, the study of these three elements, drawn in the illuminations of the time, allowed me to better understand the history and place of wine in this region. In the invaluable library of San Millán de Cogolla, we also have pictorial and graphic elements of universal importance, such as images of the Beatus de Liébana. Here we see images of the crops grown in the region at the time. We see here how God is trying to protect the countryside. We can also see these angels and each farmer harvest the vines, in other words, harvest the fruit. We can see God, the angels. Here are the farmers and the peasants, the vines, the grapes, and the tools they used. This is evidence that wine production clearly existed in the region. This is not a coincidence. The writings and sites discovered in Rioja are physical testaments of the existence of viticulture at the time.
Beyond the writings, Rioja's wine-growing history can be read in its earth. Archaeologists Carlos López de Calle and Juan Manuel Tudanca López made some surprising discoveries while searching the soil on a hill southeast of Logroño, starting with a cellar in perfect condition.
Look over here. This one. And this one here. They're incredible. And these broken arches are fantastic as well. We made a scan of this cellar that allows us to see what's invisible to the naked eye. This allowed us to imagine the environment in its entirety and to visualize almost all the details of the cellar. When we began searching the site, the cellar was concealed, completely covered. It's an amazing discovery. Thanks to the scanner, we can analyze its construction and see the position of the wine silos as well as the areas that were reserved for the winemaking in the medieval period.
Their research is just beginning. The discovery of this cellar and the 3 wine silos allowed them to hypothesize about 13th century winemaking methods. Archaeologists discovered openings, vents, and silos that allowed the pressed grapes to descend directly into the cellar, to be put into barrels and then stored. But the real treasure on the site lies in the discovery of plant debris.
We are mixing the earth to liberate the residues. The material you see here was charred by fire, and that's why it floats. This allows us to classify all the plant species. What is appearing? Carbonized seeds. We'll study them to know their age and identify the plant species that were present at the time. We hope that in the next few months, we'll be able to determine what quantities and varieties of grape seeds are in this zone.
By sequencing the DNA of plant residues found on the site, Professor Carlos Lopez's team is progressively decrypting the agricultural carpet surrounding this medieval farm composed of olive trees, fruit trees, and mostly vineyards. Thanks to these seeds, the scientists hope to reveal what different grape varieties once reigned in this region of Spain. The oldest grape variety still vinified today is the Tempranillo, considered the king of grapes in Rioja. It's a red variety which matures early, hence its name, which comes from the term temprano, which means early in Spanish. In the north of the region, Juan Carlos Sancha, descendant of several generations of winemakers, surveys his small property of 12 acres. He has a particular attachment to this grape variety that's been planted here since the 19th century. These old vines have the particularity of having very deep roots. They allow the grapes to draw their resources from an arid soil, rich in minerals, maximizing the exchange between earth and vines. Over time, the berries have become smaller, they produce less juice, their skin is concentrated in tannins. Despite a lower yield, they allow for more structured wines known for their aromas.
We are in the Cerro de la Isa vineyard. It is one of the 804 unique and endemic vineyards listed in Rioja, and these vines give an exceptional wine. This vineyard was planted by my great-grandfather and my grandfather in 1905. That is to say, this very tannic vineyard is currently 113 years old. There is a saying that the best soups are made with old pots, and in the case of this vineyard, that holds true. Unfortunately, in the last 40 years, most of the old vines have disappeared. A high-profit strategy started. Young vines give more wine, so owners preserved only 10% of vineyards over 40 years old, and less than 1% of century-old vineyards. We are in one of the few century-old Tempranillo vineyards. This is my family's story. My family's been here for 5 generations, and my goal is to make these vines last another 5 generations.
Juan Carlos Sancha is passionate about plant diversity and rare species. He regularly explores the nature that surrounds his fields. During one of his excursions, he discovered these exceptional vines, Vitis sylvestris. Like lianas, this ancient autochthonous wine is able to climb 50 to 65 feet with its tendrils in search of light.
"5 years ago, I tried an experiment by making wine from Vitis sylvestris vines to explore their potential from an oenological point of view. I found this plant to be too acidic and juicy. It's more interesting for biodiversity reasons than for winemaking.
Vitis sylvestri is considered by specialists to be the ancestor of cultivated wines. It dates back from the Paleolithic period.
We must transmit the greatest number of varietals to our children and preserve those inherited from our grandparents. Unfortunately, over the past 40 years, we've reduced the number of varietals due to a policy of pulling up old vines, and now we're leaving less for our children.
Juan Carlos is one of those winemakers fiercely committed to passing on the inheritance left by the elders. Some vines resist the passage of time, and some traditions persist. In a quest to preserve ancient know-how, Rioja's great families continue to perpetuate winemaking methods that have changed very little. Today, Maria goes to the cellars for the Trasegada, a delicate operation carried out during the aging of the wine in barrels. Hello, gentlemen. How's it going?
Hello, Maria. We were just about to start.
Okay, very good. Let's take a look.
This is a traditional La Rioja Trasegada, a technique imported from France that consists in emptying a barrel of wine into another barrel using gravity in order to remove the sediments at the bottom of the first barrel. We don't stir up the wine. We pour out a clean wine as clear as possible. Traditionally, we do this in one of Rioja's cellars. The wine must be poured gently. Oxygenating it helps it express all its aromas.
We are looking at its clarity. We want to observe the color and the clarity of the wine with the dim candlelight. We have to take a clean wine out from the barrel. It must have a bright, strong color. This wine is 2 years old. We call it crianza. The colors are still bright and luminous. It's a good sign. Hammering on the barrel awakens the cellar with the echoes. The level of the lees is judged by the resonance. The lee is a deposit produced by the grapes, deposited at the bottom of the barrels. It must be separated from the wine because it can change its aroma.
We've learned that respecting certain customs makes it possible to produce very high-quality wines. But there's the eternal debate on modernization, work, and effort. It's an eternal discussion that continues, with a new wine that, in the end, looks a lot like the old one.
We're a traditional Rioja winery, so naturally our methods today are still traditional. To develop our wine, we continue to use the traditional barrels, Trasegada. We continue to make wine with the ancient know-how. Reassured by the quality of her wine during this Trasegada, Maria must now look ahead to the next vintage. A few days before the harvest, with her enologist Maria Larrea, she goes to a small plot of the Imperial vineyard. It's a crucial moment, because with the refractometer, it is necessary to verify the grape's sugar content, which will determine the date for the beginning of the grape harvest. One of our great quality challenges is reflected in our Imperial wine, our flagship product. It is a family wine, which we only make when we consider that the vineyards have reached an optimum quality. It is a quality requirement that requires rigorous supervision of our teams. If during the harvest, I find that we won't reach the quality we want, then we won't make an Imperial vintage, and the vintage will never be made. For me, developing great wines is a constant requirement. The goal we have in our field, family to family, from generation to generation, has always been to develop the best wine possible. Great wines in the traditional way. At the heart of this Iberian paradise in the Rioja terroir, Maria continues to be part of a handful of winemakers who have chosen to continue a 1,000-year-old tradition with the ultimate goal of making an exceptional wine. The transmission of the cultural and family heritage is one of the pillars of a viticulture that has a global notoriety. These winemakers who have chosen this path know it. There is no great wine in Rioja, without a story behind it.